Good morning, everyone. My name is Federico Guerra from the Marche Polytechnic University of Ancona, Italy, and today I'm presenting you for the late-breaking trials our last results regarding the SAVE-ICD study. This is my declaration of interests. I have to underline that the present study is a spontaneous collaboration and did not receive any specific grants from funding agency or pharmaceutical industries. Let's start by speaking about sacubitril/valsartan, and let's start by speaking about the pharmacological effect. As we all know, there are actually two different drugs. One is the sacubitril that impedes the degradation of the natriuretic peptides and it also impedes degradation of bradykinin. And the other one is valsartan, known for a long time, which improves the effect of the AT2-mediated receptor, is an angiotensin receptor inhibitor, AT1 receptor inhibitor. All these two drugs work together in order to produce a lot of good pathophysiological response in terms of vasodilatation, in terms of diuresis, natriuresis, and in terms of reduced organ damage, cardiac organ damage, such as fibrosis and hypertrophy. We also know that from the guidelines, we should evaluate a patient for sacubitril/valsartan when let's say the other therapy, such as inhibitor, beta blockers, ARB, and MRI antagonists are not enough. The patient is still symptomatic, and the left ventricular ejection fraction is lower than or equal to 35%. We also know from this slide that in these patients, if they still have reduced ejection fraction, severely reduced ejection fraction despite optimal medical therapy, they have to be considered for an ICD. So, sacubitril/valsartan and ICD implant are a parallel decision to make in the natural history of a patient with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. We also know from previous evidence that sacubitril/valsartan produces a positive reverse remodeling of the left ventricle, which translates in overall lower left ventricular systolic volumes and an increase in ejection fraction after chronic therapy. This improvement in ejection fraction is also mainly probably responsible for the reduction in arrhythmic events. I'm speaking about ventricular arrhythmias. In this case, in this patient, we saw from this paper that patient treated with sacubitril/valsartan experienced significantly less VT and significantly less non-sustained VT over a follow-up of 9 months. And so we started from these evidences in order to think about an observational registry that is the SAVE-ICD, and that is the one I'm going to present right now. The aim and primary endpoint of the SAVE-ICD is to assess how many patients with sacubitril/valsartan improved so much so they get out of the indication for primary prevention, ICD, after 6 months of treatment. We wanted to see how many patients had a positive reverse remodeling so important that they did not meet the criteria for ICD implantation anymore. Our secondary endpoints included an improvement, of course, in left ventricular ejection fraction, left ventricular volumes, clinical improvement, and the interaction between dose improvement and the maximum dose of sacubitril/valsartan. The inclusion and exclusion criteria are quite simple. We wanted to make this observational study a real-world observational study, so as you can see, very few inclusion criteria. You have to be eligible for sacubitril/valsartan therapy, and you have to have an ICD implant for primary prevention. Secondary prevention were obviously excluded. For the exclusion criteria, We excluded patients with resynchronization therapy because, of course, it's the main confoundant of the improvement in left ventricular ejection fraction and volumes that our patients experience with sacubitril valsartan. And we also excluded patients that had appropriate ICD therapy before enrollment because they obviously still needed an ICD for sudden cardiac death prevention. This is a joint collaboration endorsed by the Italian Association of Arrhythmology and Cardiostimulation. 10 centers from Italy, mainly hub, big arrhythmologic center, you can see it here in the map, responded to our call. And this is the general characteristic of our population. We had 230 patients, all starting sacubitril valsartan, all with an ICD, and all with remote monitoring. Remote monitoring was very important because with remote monitoring we were able to assess as endpoint every single VT, even if it was non-clinical, even if it was not perceived by the patient. So with a remote monitoring we had the certainty to include all potential events. This is a baseline characteristic, as you can see here. I will show it, but I won't discuss it in order to go to the main results. And this is our primary endpoint. Out of 230, 4 patients died during follow-up. Follow-up was 6 months for end-stage heart failure. The mean absolute increase in ejection fraction was nearly 4%. That's more or less similar to what already known from current literature. What we see most importantly in this patient that at the end of 6 months follow-up, we have 57 patients, that's roughly 1 out of 4 patients, that has an improvement of left ventricular ejection fraction over 35%, and they have no appropriate ICD therapies, and so they did not meet anymore the inclusion criteria for ICD implantation in primary prevention. If you hypothesize 100 heart failure patients with these characteristics, after 6 months of therapy with sacubitril valsartan, nearly 1 out of 4 of those patients could avoid ICD implantation. And if you consider a mean national system, Italian national system reimbursement for an ICD implantation of 1,700 euros, this roughly translates to a cost saving of 460,000 euros for 100 patients. There is also a secondary endpoint. As you can see here, nearly 60% of our population had an absolute increase in left ventricular ejection fraction, so not all the patients have a positive reverse remodeling after therapy with sacubitril valsartan. We did not have a significant interaction between the improvement in ejection fraction and the maximum tolerated dose of sacubitril valsartan, as it was previously described from current literature. It must also be stated that the dose of sacubitril valsartan was a positive predictor of left ventricular ejection fraction improvement. Patients with 24-26 milligram twice daily dose responded less in terms of positive remodeling compared with the other 2 available dosages. Another predictor of left ventricular ejection fraction improvement, a negative predictor, is baseline left ventricular ejection fraction. The lower the ejection fraction, the more difficult it is to have a positive remodeling and so on improvement. An important limitation of our study is also the fact that 12 patients, that's 5% of our population, had 1 or more ventricular arrhythmias episode during follow-up. This obviously is related also to the increase in left ventricular ejection fraction. As you can see here, patient improving more than 10% in absolute value have no ICD shock on ATPs, but we must take into consideration that during the first 6 months after sacubitril/valsartan, the arrhythmic risk is reduced, but as you can see here, it's not completely abolished. So the idea to protect the patient from ICD with an ICD or with, for example, other kinds of devices must be considered, because these patients are still at risk. We don't know how much this risk it is. We know that less than the risk with no sacubitril/valsartan, but it's not zero. So it's very difficult for us to conclude that it's safe to avoid ICD implantation in those patients. So for conclude, after 6 months of sacubitril/valsartan, 1 patient out of 4 experienced no arrhythmic events and show an improvement of ejection fraction more than 35%, and thus not meeting the criteria for the ICD implantation anymore. Assuming, but is a finding that needs more data to be considered solid, the treatment of 100 patients with sacubitril/valsartan after 6 years could be cost-effective in preventing ICD implants in a minority of them. 5% of primary prevention patients still had an arrhythmic event in the first 6 months, so the arrhythmic risk in this patient is lowered but not suppressed, and increasing the doses of sacubitril/valsartan over 24-26 twice daily is important as a positive predictor of left ventricular ejection fraction improvement and cardiac positive remodeling. With this, I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to thank you, my colleagues. Here you can see all the authors that collaborated to this wonderful project along with their affiliation. Thank you.